Okay, so sorry for the delay. We are continuing our study of the prophets. We are working our way through Jonah, that was a while ago, but Amos, and now Hosea. We've got our kind of relative timeline, you can see. Talked about Jonah a while back and his being sent to Nineveh to preach judgment. Then Amos, of course, directing that judgment at Israel. And now, of course, Hosea talking or clarifying what the extent of that judgment is going to be. And just the timeline, Jonah back the first third of Jeroboam II's reign, Amos taking over after that, and now we are looking at Hosea, who ministered during the time of Jotham and Hezekiah. This will become increasingly relevant tonight. So here's my more elaborate timeline that I'm quite proud of. And I made the comparison before that I see Amos and Hosea kind of working together, Amos giving us more of a generic what is happening with Israel, whereas Hosea is going to get more into the details, the specifics, why Israel's being judged. And so here we are. We're back in Hosea. And the book, I think, can be, and others have made this connection, that it can be sort of divided into halves. So the first half, I'll refer to it loosely as an allegory. It is Hosea's marriage to Gomer. And it's not that the story itself didn't happen, but that it is being used symbolically to describe Israel's relationship, Yahweh's relationship to Israel. And the allegorical narrative takes place in three parts. So you've got the beginning, which is the story itself, that Hosea is told to go and marry this woman, knowing that she's not going to be faithful. Then we get chapter 2, which is the pronouncement of judgment, what's going to happen to her because she's been unfaithful. And then the third chapter is about sort of the command to Hosea to get her back, to restore his relationship to her even though she's been unfaithful. And from 4 on, we get a series of sermons, if we want to call it that, writings, and I think they follow a very similar structure. So last week we did 4 to 6, which focuses on just elaboration on what the extent of Israel's disobedience has been. And then we get from 6 to 10, the pronouncement of judgment. What's going to happen to Israel because Israel's been disobedient. And then the last couple of chapters are going to be how Yahweh plans to restore his relationship to Israel. And so we're going to be ambitious and try and get through 4 chapters tonight. I know we started late. So 6 to 10, the judgment against Israel, and it begins in verse 4. What am I going to do with you, Ephraim? What am I going to do with you, Judah? Your loyalty is like the morning mist and like the early dew that vanishes. We're getting a full house tonight. Ephraim is just another way of saying Israel, right? He'll refer to it as Israel, Ephraim, Jacob. It is interesting that Judah is already included in this sort of initial statement. It says Judah's going to get mentioned a couple of times tonight. And then he says, your loyalty. And tonight we're going to see my frustration with Hosea. I've already teased that when I was first going through the minor prophets, studying them and teaching them in other capacities, I was told by multiple professors, as you go through the prophets, you're going to realize that there's at least one you don't like. And for me, it's Hosea. Hosea is the one that just kind of annoys me for a couple of reasons. The 2 big ones are, Hosea doesn't know when to move on. He's one of those pastors who just gets stuck on a topic and will just keep bringing up the topic over and over and over again. It's like, okay, we get the point. Can we move on to the next point? Not that you've ever heard sermons like that. The other thing is, he's one of those pastors that once he gets his, like a bulldog, right? He starts gnawing on a metaphor, and he can't let the metaphor die. And he will bring up the metaphor well past its usefulness. And we're going to see that tonight as well. So your loyalty. This is going to be kind of something he's going to play with, the idea of loyalty. So your loyalty is like the morning mist and the dew. So the metaphor is rather obvious, right? You go outside in the morning and there's dew on the ground and the dew doesn't last, right? So your loyalty may appear briefly, but very quickly it's going to disappear. So verse 5, this is why I have used the prophets to cut them down. So this is going to be another theme metaphor for this whole section, the idea of the harvest. So he has sent the prophets in like people harvesting. So we go from the metaphor of, again, his metaphors get complicated. So we go from the grass on the dew, right? So the prophets went in to cut the grass. And then he goes on, I have killed them with the words of my mouth. My judgment strikes like lightning. So he's talking about the people who've been disobedient. The prophets had to go and cut them down like the grass that was too high that was collecting all the dew. His metaphors get really elaborate. Verse 6, for I desire loyalty and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. He'd already said, right? Your loyalty is like the morning dew. Your loyalty doesn't last. It's not real. It's not permanent. And now he says, what I want is loyalty, which he then contrasts with the sacrifices. I don't want temporary worship. I don't want non-permanent worship or non-permanent religiosity or however you want to think of it. And then he says the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. We know this sentiment more popularly through David in Psalm 51. You do not want sacrifice or I'd give it. You're not pleased with burnt offerings. The sacrifice pleasing to God is a broken spirit, and so on. So this idea has been stated before elsewhere in Scripture, but this is a pretty significant verse, especially for the minor prophets. And this is an idea that as we go forward in the minor prophets will be iterated in other ways. And then a really fun verse, verse 6. But they, like, or perhaps at Adam, have violated the covenant. There they have betrayed me. This is a really fun verse because the wording, even in Hebrew, is incredibly awkward. And the obvious question is, what on earth do we mean by Adam? And the main issue is how to understand Hebrew prepositions. So Hebrew really only has 3 prepositions. They have be, le, and ka. And the prepositions, each one has 2 major meanings, dominant meanings. So starting from the bottom up, ka is how they create similes, so like or as. It's a comparison. So if you want to say something is like something, you just say ka. If you want to have directional, you can say la, which can mean to or for something. But then if you want to suggest proximity, you use ba. And ba can mean in something or by something. And it's not always clear which is which. So this is fun, right? So there's context. Well, context matters. All right, fair enough. But they, blank Adam, have violated the covenant. There they have there, which suggests location. There they have betrayed me. Gilead is the city of evildoers, tracked with bloody footprints, like raiders who wait in ambush for someone. A band of priests murders on the road to Shechem. They commit atrocities. So we have a reference to Adam, then we have a reference to Gilead, and then Shechem. Gilead and Shechem are both places. So logically, now all of you heard the word Adam and you're thinking of a person. But verses 8 and 9 plus the word there suggests a location. And now you're wondering, well, wait. Adam's a person, Adam's not a place. Or is Adam a place? So here's our handy-dandy map. The yellow, just to give you some sense of location or proximity, is Jerusalem. You should know where that is, next to the Dead Sea. And then up at the top, the green is Gilead. The red is Shechem. And then the blue is Adam. A very important event happened at Adam. Any guesses? I'll give you a hint. Adam is right next to the Jordan. That's a very good guess. It's next to Jordan, so they crossed the Jordan. Now the question is, who crossed the Jordan at Adam? That's where Joshua crossed with the ark. when they first come into Israel. So, what he could be saying is they have violated the covenant ever since they first entered the land when they came into Adam. So they've been in violation since the very beginning. Now, of course, the alternative would be to read this as some sort of like, or in the sense of we have violated in Adam, or we are in violation with Adam. So like Adam, right, he betrayed the original covenant in the garden, although there's no clear connection that Adam was in covenant, but that's a whole other theological issue. That we have been in corporate violation since literally the beginning of creation. Commentaries, theologians are not in agreement as to which is preferable. Are we talking about they have been in violation since the crossing of Joshua, so before there was even a nation, or are we talking about all the way back to Adam and Eve? I don't have a good answer for you. I am sorry. And if they're in violation of a covenant, and it's not Adam, but the location of Adam, then we're talking about which covenant are they in violation of. Is it the Mosaic covenant? Is it the Abrahamic covenant? He doesn't really give us a whole lot of information on this. But moving on. So verse 9, like raiders who wait in ambush for someone, a band of priests murders on the road to Shechem. They commit atrocities. And then verse 10, I have seen something horrible in the house of Israel. Ephraim's promiscuity is there. Israel is defiled. And then verse 11, a harvest is appointed for you, Judah, when I return my people from captivity. So I've broken this up and put them all together because in verse 10 we have, I have seen something horrible. But it's not clear what he's referring to. Is he referring to the events of 9, right, that he's seen this band of priests committing atrocities? Or is he talking about the possible judgment that is coming for both Israel and Judah? So is he referring back to what he just said, or is he referring to what is coming? And it's not really clear. Now, when he says the horrors of Shechem, right, the band of priests on the road to Shechem, that should probably put in our minds the Levite and the concubine. And he's going to have multiple little references to not only Judges, but also the end of Judges. And when he talks about this band of roving priests, is this literal? Have a group of priests kind of turned together into highwaymen or gangsters of some sort? Or is this purely hyperbolic? He's talking about it symbolically, that the priests are mismanaging their office or they're mistreating the people just like bandits. Or is this some sort of cultural reference that there are outlaws that are pretending to be priests in order to abuse people, right? They'll put on like a priest's costume and then they'll act like priests in order to steal or take advantage of people. We don't know because he doesn't tell us what he's talking about. All he's letting us know is things are really bad. And this reference to the priests acting out does seem to intimate a context not dissimilar to the end of Judges, where we have Levites misbehaving, we have priests misbehaving. Things are bad. Things are really bad in Israel. Verse 11, a harvest is also appointed for you, Judah, when I return my people from captivity. So we've already been told this, right? Amos, who we did before, lists a series of judgments that are coming. He gives us kind of the first oracle judgment of the nations. And the 7th one on his list is Judah. Judah is on the chopping block, but he says, Judah, you're going to get judged too, but not yet. The judgment's going to come first to Israel. And we've already been seeing that, we saw last time, that part of the case being made against Israel is that Israel, the more Israel sins, the more Israel is leading her sister Judah into sin. And God is going to punish Israel because Judah wants to be like her sister, and the sins of Israel are being multiplied in Judah. So this is all one big problem. And just to give the verse, back in Amos 2, the Lord says, I will not relent from punishing Judah for 3 crimes, even 4. So Judah is going to receive her harvest but it's going to be after Israel's harvest is done. So when are we coming from captivity? That's going to be after the Assyrian period, but we're still not quite at the Assyrian judgment yet. That's coming. It's not too far off, but it's not yet. Then chapter 7. When I heal Israel, the sins of Ephraim and the crimes of Samaria will be exposed. They will practice fraud, a thief breaks in, a raiding party pillages outside, but they will never consider that I remember all their evil. Now their sins are all around me. They are right in front of my face. So the healing of Israel is probably a reference to the judgment that is coming. He is going to purge Israel. He's going to cleanse Israel. And this is going to involve a lot of pain, right? The sins are going to be exposed. The evil is going to be exposed. The idea that, and this is something that Israel is facing, and Judah is going to face it, because this is something that Amos talks about. There's this sentiment going around that, oh, God is loving, God is kind, God is good, and he's not going to punish us because we're the people of God. And Amos is, no, that's not how this works. And here Hosea is saying, no, I remember your evils. I have taken account of them, and there's going to be a judgment. It's going to come for Israel. Then we're going to see the same thing with Judah, where Judah's going to have the same attitude. Oh, we're not going to be judged because we're the good tribe. We're the tribe of David. And a judgment is coming. So verse 3, they please the evil with their king. They please the king with their evil, as princes with their lies. All of them commit adultery. They're like an oven heated by a baker who stops stirring the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. So we're going to see this play with the idea of the king. They appease their king, they're following their king, but they also don't like their king, and we're going to see how he goes about with that. They commit their adultery. So here we have the direct marriage metaphor coming back, but we already know that what he's mad about is the lack of loyalty. But their failure to be loyal is tied to their committing adultery, right? Their adultery is a cultic metaphor, right? They're not being faithful to Yahweh. And now we get another one of his metaphors. So we get this, they're like an oven heated by a baker who stops stirring the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. We're going to see this a couple of times. And the basic image is you've got a baker, right? And what the baker has to do is he's got his big oven. So he lights the oven, right? He puts wood in, puts the coals in, and he gets the fire really, really hot, and then he lets it go. He lets the fire die down. So then he goes and he kneads the dough, he gets everything ready, and he bakes it, and he gets all the bread ready to be baked, but he doesn't keep kneading the fire. But even though the fire has died down, and if you're not, the metaphor is, even though he is not tending to the fire at the moment, and you may think the fire has died down, the fact is it's still hot. Just because the baker is not currently tending to the coals doesn't mean that the oven isn't hot. That's the metaphor. And we're going to come back to this metaphor. So verse 5, on the day of our king, the princes are sick with the heat of wine. There is a conspiracy with traitors. We don't know what the day of the king is. Some sort of ceremony, some sort of, are they crowning the king? Are they honoring the king? It's not clear. But the king, it's his day, whatever that means. And the leaders are all drunk because they're celebrating. They're drinking to the point that they're making themselves sick. And this is supposed to be a day celebrating the wonders of the king. And there's a conspiracy afoot because they're not honoring the king. They have no intention of honoring the king. We're going to get an elaboration on this. So verse 6, for their hearts like an oven, draw him into their oven. Their anger smolders all night. In the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. All of them are as hot as an oven, and they consume their rulers. All the kings fall, and not one of them calls on me. So the idea is we're back to the oven, right, to the baker's oven. So the baker makes the fire, he gets it all ready, and then he leaves, and he lets it kind of die down. And you think, oh, it's not hot anymore, or it's died down, or whatever. Well, once you stir the coals, it roars back up. That's the metaphor. So even though they're not constantly tending to it, the fire has not gone away. And At a moment's notice, it can burst into full-on flames. And that's how their attitude is. That's how Yahweh's attitude is towards Israel, but also how their attitude is towards their king. And this is a problem because we don't know exactly what year he's writing in, but it's during the time of Hezekiah for Judah. And to give an idea of just how tumultuous Israel is politically, this is the best way I can show it. So at the top right, we've got the sort of really early monarchy. We've got Saul, we've got David, then we have the very brief united monarchy with Solomon. And then on the green, we have the descendants of David. On the red, we have the line of Israel. It starts with Jeroboam. He is our first monarch for Israel. Then they're replaced by Omri. There's the house of Omri, and that's Ahab's dad. Eventually, the house of Omri is judged by Jehu, and then you get the house of Jehu. And that goes through all the way to Jeroboam II. Jehu, right, he's the one who eliminated all the priests of Baal, but he left paganism and the shrines intact. And so he was told that he would have 4 generations and then it would all come crumbling down. So his final heir is Zechariah. And Zechariah is assassinated, I believe this is right. He's assassinated in 753. Over the next 20 years, there will be 4 assassinations. That's 4 assassinations in 20 years. That means things are not going good politically when the throne has just become this revolving door. And if you can't establish a ruler, right, there's no political consistency, there's no cultural consistency, right? This is what he means when he's talking about all the conspiracies and the backbiting and the backstabbing. And that's what's going on, publicly. That's what people see, it's what the world sees. They know that things are not going well. And that's just the front, right? Because these are the leaders that the world sees, right? They're the country's head, the national head, the figurehead. And this is what we see publicly, and it's just as bad privately, if not worse. Right? This is what's going on with regard to the royal family, to all that, and it just kind of trickles down to the common riffraff and so on. This is not a good time to be living in Israel. So verse 8. Ephraim has allowed himself to get mixed up with the nations. Ephraim is unturned, bread baked on a griddle. Foreigners consume his strength, but he does not notice. Even his hair is streaked with gray. He does not notice. So he loves returning to his metaphors and mixing his metaphors. So Ephraim has allowed herself to get mixed up with the nations. We see this repeatedly. It's a bad idea to get entangled with foreign affairs. We're going to get a clarification about what that means exactly. And then he returns to the whole baker metaphor. It's like bread that's been baking too long on one side. And foreigners consume his strength. He doesn't notice. And we get a clarification what that means. His hair is streaked with gray. This is someone who is aging past his prime but doesn't want to admit it, doesn't accept it. Ephraim thinks he's stronger and younger and more fit than he really is. Verse 10, Israel's arrogance testifies against them, yet they do not return to Yahweh their God, and for all this they do not seek him. So Ephraim has become like a silly, senseless dove. They call to Egypt and they go to Assyria. So all of this, I think, is probably best summarized in verse 11. Ephraim has been making a lot of really dumb choices, religiously, politically, culturally, and this is one of the examples that Hosea decides to focus on. So what does he mean by making bad alliances and relying on other nations and so on? This is his example. Ephraim has become so dumb politically that Ephraim decided that he wanted to align herself with Egypt. which historically has not really been a friend to Israel. You know, Egypt is where they came out of the captivity. Pharaoh is widely used throughout the scripture as one of the most evil people in all of the Bible. And yet, Ephraim has decided to go and side with Egypt. And they think that Egypt is going to protect him, from Assyria. Now, I don't have a map up here, but Israel is on the coast or near the coast of the Levant. Egypt is way down south, and Assyria is up north. And Ephraim thinks that if Assyria comes to take Israel, that Egypt's going to intervene. Egypt has no intention of saving Ephraim from Assyria. This is from a commentary, and this just kind of helps understand the mistakes that Israel has made historically. So under Menahem, Israel submitted to Assyrian suzerainty. So back in 743 to 738, Assyria came and said, look, you either submit to us, become our vassal, or we're going to wipe you out. So Israel said, okay, we'll submit to you. That's fine. Well, then under Pekah, who, again, we don't know exactly when Hosea is writing, but Pekah is the next king. Pekah is technically the last true king. Pekah decided to join a coalition against Assyria. Now, again, under the previous administration, they submitted to Assyrian rulership. But then the next administration comes in and says, no, we're going to align ourselves against Assyria. And then Hoshea, who's kind of the last the interim king, he also tries to acknowledge Assyrian rulership for a time, but then stopped paying the tribute money and decided to align himself with Egypt. So it would make sense that Hosea is writing around this time, which means we're getting pretty close to the end. We're getting kind of close to the end of Israel's history, because Assyria is not going to take kindly to this, right? They submitted, and then they walked away, kind of allied herself with some anti-Assyrian countries, and then when Assyria defeated them, Israel was saying, no, we'll come back and submit to you. And then instead of paying the taxes, the tribute money to Assyria, decided they're going to align themselves with Egypt. And that is when Assyria finally says, we're done with you, because we're not putting up with this anymore. So if you've ever, just as a summary, if you're like, why was Assyria so mad at Israel? This is why. We're just kind of summarizing the international politicking that went on that made Assyria so mad at Israel. Not that any of you follow the news and all the goings-on about Ukraine and Russia, and is Ukraine a part of NATO, is it not a part of NATO, and it goes back and forth and so on. This has been going on, this type of politicking and backtracking and backsliding, it's been going on for a very long time. I'm not making a direct comparison, but again, is Israel aligned with Assyria? Is it not? Is it going to pay tribute? Is it not? Is it going to do this? Is it going to do that? It keeps going back and forth, and finally Assyria says, we're done. We're just going to wipe you out, which they did very easily. It does. So verse 12, as they are going, I will spread my net over them. I will bring them down like birds of the sky. I will discipline them in accordance with the news that reaches their assembly. Verse 13, woe to them, for they fled from me. Destruction to them, for they rebelled against me. Though I want to redeem them, they speak lies against me. They do not cry to me from their hearts. Rather, they wail on their beds. They slash themselves for grain and new wine. They turn away from me. We saw this with Amos as well, this basic idea that, as bad as, because with Amos we saw the same idea, that God has brought troubles on Israel, and the idea is that as things get worse, they should be turning to Yahweh for help and for answers. But instead, they either double down, they harden their hearts, or they turn to other gods. And here, Hosea is kind of clarifying that it's not just that they don't turn to Yahweh, they're turning to other entities, right? They're slashing themselves, they're praying to other gods for grain, wine, help, and so on. Verse 15, I trained and strengthened their arms, but they plot against me. They turn, but not to what is above. They are like a faulty bow. Their leaders will fall by the sword because of the cursing of their tongue. They will be ridiculed for this in the land of Egypt. Now, he loves his metaphors, which is frustrating. They are not going back to Egypt. They've already gone back to Egypt in a political sense, right? They've aligned themselves with Egypt. And so you can kind of get this teasing of this play that he's doing, sort of irony, satirical irony. They've gone back to Egypt politically, and so he's going to send them to Egypt, although they're not physically going to Egypt, right? They're going into captivity. So just like they were captives in Egypt, they're going to be captives again. Only this time, he's not sending them to Egypt where they want to go. Again, we're stretching the metaphor very thin. He's going to send them into captivity into another nation. They're going to captivity in Assyria. Chapter 8. Put the horn to your mouth. One like an eagle comes against the house of the Lord, because they transgress my covenant and rebel against my law. Which covenant are we talking about? Is the Mosaic covenant, the Adamic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant? He doesn't clarify, but he also, we know, especially with Hosea, he loves to mingle the covenant language with the marriage language, right? They violated the covenant just like a wife has betrayed her husband. Israel cries out to me, my God, we know you. Israel has rejected what is good. An enemy will pursue him. There are a lot of parallels between Hosea and Ezekiel. In my opinion, Ezekiel's a better book, it's better written. But here he talks about the eagle is coming. Well, Hosea has an entire, very elaborate allegory of the two eagles. And here he's talking about nations. So the first eagle is the king of Babylon, the nation of Babylon, who's going to come and take Judah. And then he has the second eagle is going to come, which is Egypt is going to fight, and they're going to fight over Judah. So here, Hosea is talking about this eagle is going to come, is going to swoop down and pick up Israel. Here, the eagle is Assyria, right? So the eagle represents one of the nations. For Hosea, it's Assyria. Verse 4, they have installed kings, but not through me. They have appointed leaders, but without my approval. They made their silver and gold unto idols for themselves, for their own destruction. Now, I've gone through this on multiple occasions. Israel was not really meant to have a king, but they were given provisions to establish one. This goes all the way back in Deuteronomy 17, where we have the law of the king. And so there's a whole process to be made, although Samuel told them over and over again, you don't really want a king because kings lead to problems, but there is a way in Deuteronomy to establish one, and once you have the king, there are the three prohibitions. Kings can't have horses, they can't have women, and they can't have gold, because the horses are for the army, the women are a harem, and then the gold is for a treasury. And these are how kings build up their strength, right, through armies, international marriages, foreign marriages, and then the treasury. And the king has to be reliant on Yahweh. No king honored this, right? David broke it, Solomon broke it. I mean, Solomon with his 1,000 women. Verse 5, your calf idol is rejected, Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For this thing is from Israel. A craftsman made it, and it is not God. The calf of Samaria will be smashed to bits. So this, of course, is referring to the golden calves that were made under Jeroboam the first. Right, we've already mentioned this, but all the way back when the kingdom was split and half of it was given to Jeroboam, and he wanted to give the people a way to worship without going to Jerusalem, because he knew that if they had to travel all the way down to Jerusalem to worship, then eventually the nation would probably come back together. And he knew also that people were fed up. They were kind of annoyed with the fact that if you're living all the way up in Dan or wherever, it's a pain to have to go all the way down to Jerusalem to give your yearly sacrifices or however often you want to do it. So he decided, well, I'm going to make things convenient, and I'm going to make 2 golden calves, and I'm going to put one in the south and one in the north, and we're going to have 2 shrines so that you can worship wherever it's closest. And he wasn't supposed to do this, obviously. But he did it anyway, and things just, this opens the door for all the paganism and all that stuff. So the judgment is coming against these calves, right, that symbolize all the paganism that has infected Israel since literally Jeroboam the first. And Amos, which we did earlier, he also talks about this, about how the high places will be smashed and how the judgment against Jeroboam is coming. So Jeroboam, of course, he was the first king. This is Jeroboam the first. And he is the one who created these calves. He is the one who introduced paganism into Israel. So again, Amos and Hosea, they go together very well. And going back to our warning, so Samuel, when he doesn't mention paganism, which is odd, you would think that he would, but when he tells the people back in chapter 8, because we went through Samuel, it's been a year in Samuel, he warned the people. It's like, you don't want a king like we want a king. Because you don't want a king because they're going to do three things, right? They're going to take your sons, they're going to take your daughters, and they're going to take all your property. Now, he doesn't include this, which is odd, but the kind of unspoken fourth thing is kings are political, and kings like to do what the people want them to. And the kings are going to bring in foreign ideas. They're going to bring in foreign culture. They're going to bring in foreign practices. They're going to bring in foreign gods. Solomon marries foreign women who bring in foreign customs and foreign gods. So Jeroboam is not the first king to introduce paganism to Israel. Actually, Solomon is. So we have plenty of warnings against the horrors of the king. But they wanted a king. God told Samuel, go ahead and give him a king, even though they've been warned. And now that we're at Hosea, we're finally seeing the fruition, the harvest of all the problems that come from them bringing their kings in. Verse 7, indeed they sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. You've all heard this, and you probably didn't know this from Hosea. There is no standing grain. What sprouts fail to yield flour. Even though they did, foreigners would swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up. Now they are among the nations like discarded pottery. There's nothing left to harvest. This is all metaphoric. But even if there was, it's going to go to foreign agents because Assyria is coming. He's going to say this a few other times. Verse 9, for they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey going off on its own. Ephraim has paid for love. Even though they hire lovers among the nations, I will now round them up, and they will begin to decrease in number under the burden of the kings and leaders. So, again, we get our mixing of metaphors. They have paid for love. Ezekiel loves this idea that he elaborates on this in his infamous chapter 16 metaphor, where he basically says that Israel, Judah, isn't even a prostitute, because prostitutes, they charge for their services. You're a dumb prostitute because you pay people to abuse you. And he's like, you're paying for the love of these other nations. You're paying for the attention of other gods. You're hiring out your own services. And bad things come from that. There are going to be severe consequences. So verse 11, when Ephraim multiplied his altars for sin, they became his altars for sinning. Though I were to write out for him 10,000 points of my instruction, they would be regarded as something strange. So, this is connected to the paying for love, that they have just been multiplying altars, right? Because they want the blessings of the gods, they want to be like the other nations, and so they've been multiplying their pagan practices, multiplying their sin, and in response, almost ironically or almost humorously, he's like, I could just write out all the things you're doing wrong, but you wouldn't listen, you wouldn't read them, you wouldn't care. As if he hasn't already, right? They already have the Torah, they already have Deuteronomy. So he's like, even if I were to explain to you what's going on, you wouldn't care. Verse 13, though they offer sacrificial gifts and eat the flesh, the Lord does not accept them. Here he's going to elaborate on this, but we had a very similar statement made back in Amos 4. Come to Bethel and rebel. Rebel even more to Gilgal. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tents every 3 days. Offer leavened bread, and so on. For that is what you Israelites love to do. And what he's saying is, you love to go through the motions of offering your sacrifices, offering your free will offerings, because you think that, well, if I go and make my offerings on Saturday, which is when they worship, then I can sin the rest of the week. And God's like, no, that's not how this works. Because I don't want them. I don't want your sacrifices, which Hosea has already told us, right? God doesn't want the offerings. So the Lord does not accept them. Now He will remember their guilt and punish their sins. They will return to Egypt. So the guilt, the penalty that comes from their disobedience, from their sin, from all the crimes they've committed, right? The guilt is the accumulated, as you have violated the law, right, the penalties are building up, essentially. And they don't just go away. At some point, you are going to have to pay those penalties. And now he goes, they will return to Egypt, which we already know they want because they align themselves with Egypt. They want to go back to Egypt. They've been wanting to go back to Egypt since they left Egypt, right? They're telling Moses, let's go back to Egypt. And he's like, okay, you're going back. No, literally, they're not going back to Egypt, right? That's not going to happen. But they are going to go back into captivity. Verse 14, Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces. Judah has also multiplied fortified cities. I will send fire on their cities, and it will consume their citadels. Right? They've built up their palaces, they built up their cities, and God's going to destroy them. Chapter 9, Israel, do not rejoice jubilantly as the nations do, for you have acted promiscuously, leaving your God. You have loved the wages of a prostitute, and on every grain threshing floor and wine vat will not sustain them, and the new wine will fail them. He's telling them, so this is probably going on during the harvest festival, which is why we keep getting this repeated metaphor and references to the harvest. So there are 3 major festivals in Israel. There's the Passover, which takes place in April, which they commemorate the leaving of Egypt. There's the Festival of Weeks, which happens at the beginning of the harvest, and then there's the Festival of Booths, when they're celebrating the harvest itself. This is probably, when he's preaching this or writing all this down, is probably around the 3rd festival, because the harvest festival is a good time. They're harvesting everything's, they're storing it and all. And he's like, you shouldn't be celebrating because it is not a time of celebration. You have loved the wages of the prostitute, right? You have prostituted yourselves. You have committed adultery with these other nations and these other gods. And you act like whatever benefits or blessings you are receiving, like in the harvest, are from these other nations or other gods. And this is not going to last. This is not going to sustain you, as he says in verse 2. So verse 3, they will not stay in the land of the Lord. Instead, Ephraim will return to Egypt, and they will eat unclean food in Assyria. So you're not going to stay, you're not going to enjoy what you've received, and you're going to go back to Egypt. But by Egypt, he doesn't mean Egypt, he means Assyria. You're going into captivity to Assyria. And Amos also, very famously, he talks about you're not going to enjoy the wine that you make. You're not going to enjoy the vineyards that you plant because you're going to Assyria. So this idea has already been stated. Verse 4, they will not pour out their wine offerings to the Lord, and their sacrifices will not please him. Their food will be like the bread of mourners. All who eat it become defiled. For their bread will be for their appetites alone. It will not enter the house of the Lord. So they're not going to enjoy what they have, and they're not even going to have the time to make their vain offerings. They're not going to have time because the judgment is impending, right? The Assyrians are coming. Verse 5, what will you do on a festival day, on the day of the Lord's feast? For even if they flee from devastation, Egypt will gather them and Memphis will bury them. Thistles will take possession of their precious silver. Thorns will invade their tents. So here we get the blending, right? What will you do on a festival day? Well, it's likely that they've just celebrated the harvest, or they're preparing for the harvest, and then he says, on the day of the Lord's feasts. So he's sort of contrasting the two. The Lord is about to have his harvest. So you're either celebrating yours or getting ready to celebrate yours, and God's getting ready to celebrate his. And you think you're going to celebrate, but you're not, because the Lord's harvest is coming. Verse 7, the days of punishment have come, the days of retribution have come. Let Israel recognize it. The prophet is a fool, and the inspired man is insane because of the magnitude of your guilt and hostility. It's not entirely clear what he means by this. It could be that the prophets are just so overwhelmed they don't even know what to do anymore, or what to say, because Israel is so delusional in their sin. They're so hard-hearted. We've already know from Amos that they've run out all the prophets. They've either killed them or gotten rid of them, and there's just nothing left. So verse 8, Ephraim's watchman is with my God. The prophet encounters a fowler's snare on all his ways. Hostility is in the house of his God. This is a fan-favorite metaphor. We see it all throughout the prophets. The watchmen. The watchmen are the prophets. So a city, right? City has a wall, and there are people on the wall whose job is to watch for trouble, like for invaders or for messengers or for danger of any sort. And that's just their job, right? They just stand on the wall or in some sort of tower and they just keep a lookout. And a very popular metaphor is to describe the prophets as watchmen. Ezekiel is very, very famous for this. He calls himself the watchman. It's all throughout his book. But he's not the only one. I think most people, when they hear watchman, they just immediately associate with Ezekiel. But Isaiah calls himself a watchman. Jeremiah calls himself a watchman. Micah, Habakkuk. And again, if we go through our timeline, Hosea is the first. He's the first one to call himself the watchman. So verse 9, they have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their guilt. He will punish their sins. So Gibeah, we should remember, because that is where the Levite's concubine died. So we've got another reference to Judges. And that is in itself a retelling of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Sodom and Gomorrah being two of the cities so evil that God had to wipe them off the face of the earth. And then you have a city in Benjamin, right, in Israelite territory, a city of God that is just as wicked as Sodom and Gomorrah. And now Hosea is saying the country is just as corrupt as Gibeah. He could just as easily say the country has become as corrupted as Sodom and Gomorrah. Like that, he could just say that. I have discovered Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers like the first fruit of the fig tree in its first season, but they went to Baal Peor, consecrated themselves to shame, and became detestable like the thing that they loved. He loves his metaphors. He's like, Ezekiel talks about, I found you like a baby that was abandoned. So he goes, I found you like just wild grapes growing out in the middle of nowhere, right? I found you where no one else went, where no one else wanted you, and I brought you back. I've taken care of you. But instead of being faithful to me, instead of loyal, instead of being thankful for what I've done, you have gone and prostituted yourself, right? That is the metaphor that he keeps going back to. Baal Peor, which I'm guessing most of you don't remember, but that is back in Numbers, when the men of Israel started to have inappropriate relations with the women of Moab. So their infidelity, literally both cultic and physical infidelity, goes back to the wilderness period. They were already doing this before they even entered the land. Verse 11. Ephraim's glory will fly away like a bird. No birth, no gestation, no conception. Even if they raise children, I will bereave them of each one. Yes, woe to them when I depart from them. Because the judgment is going to be absolute, it's going to be final, it's going to affect everyone, even the children. I have seen Ephraim like Tyre planted in a meadow, so Ephraim will bring out his children to the executioner. Give them, Lord, what should you give? Give them a womb that miscarries and breasts that are dry. So he's going to clarify what he means by the children are being judged. And it's not entirely clear what he means by this. So it could be, because the idea is, Israel has become so corrupted that they're essentially killing their own children. And in God's mind, at this point, it's almost more merciful to take out Israel than to let the children grow up in this environment. Now, are we talking about, immediately we're probably thinking of sacrifices, right? Like to Moloch or whatever, that they're just offering them up as sacrifices. It could also be that because Israel has been cultivating these relationships and these international affairs, Israel's gotten themselves tangled up in all these wars, and they are sending their children to war. Either way, they're almost gleefully killing their own kids. And it's hard not to draw a comparison with where we are today. As a country, we are aborting millions of babies every year, and it seems like we are just gung-ho to get ourselves involved in World War III, which I'm guessing most of you are probably not young enough to enlist, but if we were to get into an open conflict with Russia or China or whatever, a lot of young people are going to die. And he's saying that if we persist in the way, if I allow, this is Yahweh, right? If Yahweh allows the nation to continue, all you're going to do is kill off your children anyway. And that's not more merciful. It'd be more merciful just to get rid of you now than to let you either kill your children or raise them in this horrific environment where they're just going to die anyway. So this is, in God's mind, mercy. Verse 15, all their evil appears at Gilgal, for there I came to hate them. I will drive them from my house because of their evil, wicked actions. I will no longer love them. All their leaders are rebellious. So Gilgal is one of their shrines, right? We've talked about Gilgal. And their actions have been so detestable that he has come to actually hate them. He is depriving them of his love because of what they've done. We've talked about Gilgal. He mentions the evils of Gilgal back in chapter 4. And he's not the only prophet to talk about Yahweh coming to hate his own people because of their actions. Malachi very famously does as well. So verse 16, Ephraim is struck down, their roots are withered, they cannot bear fruit. Even if they bear children, I will kill the precious offspring of their wombs. My God will reject them because they have not listened to him. They will become wanderers among the nations. Israel is a lush vine. It yields fruit for itself. The more his fruit increased, the more he increased the altars. The better his land produced, the better they made the sacred pillars. He loves his metaphors. He talked about Israel being like wild grapes that he found, he brought back, and he cultivated. And now that it's this lush vine, it is... He loves elaborating and mixing his metaphors. So as it became increasingly more bountiful, increasingly more blessed, it then turned that into a way to idolatry, right? It's using its wealth to create more pillars, more altars, and so on. Ezekiel loves this metaphor as well, that Israel is like this great vine that grows and grows. Verse 2, their hearts are devious. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and demolish their sacred pillars. So altars, we actually have an altar from this period, so this is what it looks like. Their sacred pillars, of course, are referring to their Asherah pole. So Asherah is one of the foreign gods that's talked about in various places like 1 Samuel 7. Asherah is a Sumerian fertility goddess, and we've got depictions of it. It's not entirely clear, I've mentioned this in other contexts, it's not entirely clear if by Asherah pole, if we're talking about some sort of sacred grove, like a park, where people go and do bad things, or if we're talking about like totem poles. We're never told, we don't have any because it's wood and they wouldn't last. The main thing is like with Gideon, when the angel tells him to go and chop down the Asherah poles, he doesn't ask where they are because he knows what they are and he knows where they are and he goes and he does it right away. So he doesn't question, like, why am I doing this? He knows what they are and that they're evil. So again, are we talking about some kind of park or are we talking about totem poles? We just don't know because, again, we haven't found any. Verse 3, In fact, they are now saying, we have no king. So we're back to the king sort of discussion, the king metaphor. And things have gotten so bad in the country, right? We already know that they don't respect their king. They've been killing their kings one after the other. And at this point, they're like, we don't need a king. It's just anarchy. People just doing whatever they want. Again, I mentioned this, right, that they've been killing their kings off one after the other. Verse 14, if you fear the Lord, worship and obey him, and if you don't rebel against the Lord's command, then both you and the king who rules over you will follow the Lord. This seems to be, there's this interesting parallel that the king, of course, is a reflection of the populace, right? He represents the people. And both the people and the king need to worship Yahweh. If they do, then the land will be blessed. If the people don't, and the king does, then bad things will happen, and vice versa, bad things will happen. We've got examples of kings who try to worship the Lord and lead the people in that, and during those times, the land is blessed, whether it's mainly David or Solomon. And I think I've used this before, that the good kings of Judah are the ones who either restore proper worship or are able to lead the people in proper worship. It's not just that they don't do the bad things, but they actively promote the good things. The problem with Israel is they don't have any good kings. There are no good kings of Israel. All of them allow and promote paganism in some way. And the king, of course, is a representative of God. We've got Proverbs 24, which has a really good verse. My son, fear the Lord as well as the king, and don't associate with rebels. So, proper respect to Yahweh is paralleled to proper respect with the king. And so I think when Hosea, we'll get back to that. So then, we'll come back to that. So Ecclesiastes 8, we got a great little section where if the king does not bring out proper judgment and does not live out the justice of God, the people are going to lose faith. They're going to lose faith in the king, they're going to lose faith in the justice system, and they will lose faith in Yahweh. The king is the representative of God's justice on earth. And if the king doesn't wield that properly, the people are going to rebel, eventually. This is why we take our leaders very seriously, even in the New Testament. The apostles, Paul, Peter, they tell us, take your leaders seriously, respect them, and so on, because they represent the authority of God on earth. And if they don't use that properly, then bad things will happen. So he says here in verse 3, in fact, we are now saying we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. What can a king do to us or do for us? So their lack of reverence for the king is parallel to their lack of reverence for Yahweh. And that's a problem, right? They fear neither the king nor God. We're wrapping up. They speak mere words, taking false oaths while making covenants, so lawsuits break out like poisonous weeds in the furrows of a field. Again, this seems like he loves mixing his metaphor, he loves stretching them. Their problem that Hosea keeps bringing us back to is that they have violated the one covenant that matters. Right? They have broken their covenant with Yahweh. They have committed adultery against him. And now he's saying not only have they violated their covenant with Yahweh, they don't respect that one, they don't fear Yahweh, but they are now making oaths and covenants with other entities, whether it's other people, nations, politicians, gods, or whatnot. And see, if you have only one covenant with Yahweh, then that's really easy because you just have one thing to honor. But if you're making a whole bunch of covenants, well, that's going to create problems, it's going to create complications, and there's going to be issues with that. So you've got lawsuits and all this stuff is going on. He may be speaking specifically to the political leadership at this point. He's talking about those who are either associated with the king or near the king or whatever. And he's saying that part of the problem, because he goes back and forth right, between the people themselves but also the leadership. And part of the problem is they're making false oaths, they're making false covenants, false treaties, and they're allowing things to just get out of hand. Right? 4 assassinations in 20 years, that's a problem. Not that we have any parallel today with leaders making bad treaties and bad promises and false oaths and stirring up increasingly, political tension that is trickling down and affecting us. And culturally, are we any better? Not usually, because our leaders are a reflection of us. I would say perhaps more so for us because we actually elect our leaders. However, we're told at the beginning, right, you chose your leaders because, there's no line of succession anymore. Verse 5, the residents of Samaria will have anxiety over the calf of Beth-aven. Indeed, its idolatrous priests rejoice over it. The people will mourn over it, over its glory. It will certainly depart from them. So the golden calf is going away. Assyria is coming to judge them. And when the calf is taken away, they're going to mourn it. They're going to be sad that the calf is gone. The calf itself will be taken to Assyria as an offering to the great king. Ephraim will experience shame. Israel will be shamed of its counsel. They're not upset. They're not worried about Yahweh leaving. They're not worried about Yahweh basically divorcing Israel. They're worried that they're losing their golden calves. Samaria's king will disappear like foam on the surface of the water. The high places of Aven, the sin of Israel, will be destroyed. Thorns and thistles will grow over their altars. They will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. We don't have an exact date, but the king he's talking about could very well be Hoshea, who's, again, that last kind of figurehead who makes the deal with Egypt, who brings, he's the king. He is the one on the throne when Assyria finally comes and wipes them out. Verse 9, Israel, you have sinned since the days of Gibeah, right, that's the Levite and the concubine. They have taken their stand there. Will not war against the unjust overtake them in Gibeah. I will discipline them at my discretion. Nations will be gathered against them to put them in bondage for their two crimes. The two crimes, he doesn't tell us what they are. It's probably, what makes the most sense is he's talking about perhaps the sin of Gibeah, so the sins that were going on back in the time of the judges, and now the sins of today, which are just being replicated. So you're being judged both for the sins of the past, your fathers, but also for the sins of today, because I'm not just bringing this on you because of what you're doing, but the fact is, and again, you've been committing these sins since the beginning, basically. Ephraim is a well-trained calf. He loves his metaphors. So they're upset that they're losing their calf, but they're like a calf that loves to thresh. But I will place a yoke on her fine neck. I will harness Ephraim. Judah will plow. Jacob will do the final plowing. Sow righteousness for yourselves and reap faithful love. Break up your unplowed ground. It is time to seek the Lord until he comes and sends righteousness on you like the rain. So he just called Israel and Judah these cows, and he says, you like to thresh, you like to fight and whatnot, I will turn you into animals for plowing. And then he gives them this one little, spark of hope. He's like, go ahead and sow righteousness, try to reap love, try to seek the Lord, because who knows what's going to happen? Well, then in verse 13, you have plowed wickedness and reaped injustice. So we're back to the judgment. You have eaten the fruit of lies because you have trusted in your own way and in your large number of soldiers. The roar of battle will rise against your people, and all your fortifications will be demolished in a day of war. Like Shalman's destruction of Beth Arbel, mothers will be dashed to pieces along with their children. So it will be done to you, Bethel, because of your extreme evil. At dawn, the king of Israel will be totally destroyed. So, on that note, we will conclude for tonight.